Welcome to Historically Speaking. I'm your host, Michael Dwyer, for this episode, which is titled Reminiscences of E. B. White. Our guest today is my dear friend of many years' duration, Katherine Romans Hall, who had the great privilege and opportunity to get to know the renowned author E. B. White, author of Charlotte's Web. And the way that Kathy came to know this person is by working through his papers that were deposited to Cornell University. So I am going to turn over the show to Kathy, and she has a lot to say about this wonderful writer.
Thank you, Michael. It is exciting to talk about him, even though this was a long time ago. In 1974, I got a new job at the Cornell Department of Rare Books inside their special collections. My husband was starting law school there, and so I was going to be there for 3 years. I had worked in libraries before, but I had not worked on manuscript collections, and I don't think a lot of people know what a manuscript collection is. Cornell had a huge collection of people like George Bernard Shaw and James Joyce and Nabokov, and then another person who went to Cornell and therefore agreed to deposit his papers there was Mr. White, E.B. White. And I know I'm going to slip and call him Andy, so I may as well explain right away that anybody who went to Cornell as an undergrad and whose last name was White was automatically nicknamed Andy in honor of their first president. They had such a strong sense of their history there. Andrew Dixon White was the first president of Cornell. E.B. White did not like his first name, Elwyn. He said his mother ran out of good names when she got to her 6th child. And he tried E.B., he tried E. Brooks White, he tried E.N., he tried all sorts of things. Nothing appealed to him or stuck like Andy. So from the time he was 17 until he died, people who were really close to him always called him Andy. And that he was happy with that. So his manuscript collection consisted of all of his correspondence from the time he agreed to start depositing it there and saving it. He was instructed to keep every carbon copy, every envelope, every telephone message, every Christmas card. And then it also, of course, included manuscripts, drafts, galley proofs, things that had been edited and scribbled on by his co-workers and writers. It includes all the artwork, photographs, illustrations. When he was working on Charlotte's Web, he drew things the way he wanted Garth Williams to then work on them. And he studied spiders and worked really hard on this, and so those drawings are there, and film strips, and then all sorts of memorabilia. When he got the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and he got numerous honorary doctorates, the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award, the Pulitzer Award, all of those things would be deposited there. And those of us who worked there would take an acid-free folder like this, type across the bottom, for instance, that this was EBW to, say, KSW, Katherine White, a poem or a note and the date and whether it was handwritten or typed and whether it was signed. All of those little details are very much a part of cataloging for a manuscript collection. And then every single one of these files would have a card in a card file out front. I doubt they do it that way anymore. I suspect it's all put into a computer and people access what's there by the computer. The E.B. White collection has over 25,000 pieces of correspondence sent to him. And then he was really kind about answering a lot of things when he got a batch of letters from every child in a 3rd grade because they had just finished Charlotte's Web. He would answer that. Mm-hmm. He was really wonderful. And Katherine, his wife, did a lot of that with him. So this is a huge collection, 97 cubic feet, I just found out, 265 boxes. And in one letter that I wrote to him early on in my work there, I wrote him that we had just sorted and cataloged 759 clippings of reviews of 19 of his books. And then, I was working as a general library assistant there, and not just working on the E.B. White collection. We worked on there was a Lafayette collection, there were dozens of collections. But then in 1975, my boss said, Mr. White gave us a huge amount of material. There was a whole wall of boxes already, but we haven't picked up anything from him recently, so would you strike up a correspondence with him, and ultimately we'll retrieve things from his home in Maine. So I wrote him and started this correspondence. Now, I have to back up for a second. E.B. White is known for three things, basically, although he did many more. But the children's books, Charlotte's Web, Stuart Little, and The Trumpet of the Swan. And he's renowned around the world for those. Charlotte's Web has sold over 45 million copies, and it's in over 30 languages. In 2012, which was the 60th anniversary of its publishing, it was still ranked #1 by school librarians as the best children's book, or the most popular children's book. And then the second thing that he's really well known for, and this is a big favorite of Michael's, is the elements of style. His professor, William Strunk at Cornell University, published himself a little book for all of his first-year writing students, and it was called The Little Book, and it was just very strict but very good guidelines on good writing style and writing rules. And I guess 1957, somebody who knew Mr. White from school days sent him his copy of it and said, "Remember this?" Well, Mr. White wrote a beautiful reminiscent piece in the New Yorker about that book. And then Macmillan Publishing, which published textbooks for the most part, said, "Why don't we republish this?" And so Mr. White worked on it for quite a while. A lot of the examples were pretty anachronistic and old, and he wrote a whole new chapter about style. And then it came out, and it was on the bestseller list of the New York Times for months and months and months. And that was the first time a book on style or a textbook had ever been on the bestseller list. So he's very well known for that, and it's often called just Strunk and White. And people have done wonderful later editions of it, and there's one wonderful one that has an introduction by his stepson, Roger Angel, who was also a New Yorker writer. But then the huge bulk of his work, and if you're not a reader of the New Yorker magazine, you wouldn't know this, was his more than 50 years of writing for the New Yorker. And he wrote the editorial page for many, many decades. He wrote book reviews, and he wrote humor pieces. He did those funny little news breaks that were at the bottom of the columns. That they don't have those anymore, but they were wonderful. People would send in weird little clippings, and he would add a wisecrack, and he would get this huge envelope of clippings, and he'd sift through them and find things and then mail them back to New York in time for the next issue of the New Yorker. And the other thing that he did, that some of those are his most eloquent, as the editorial voice of the New Yorker, he wrote a lot of the obituaries, sadly. We struck up a correspondence, and I ultimately did make a trip to Maine. Lucky for me, I was cataloging some other material at Cornell, and there was this wonderful long letter from Katherine White to another Cornellian that I cataloged, and of course I had to read it to catalog it, and she was going on and on about how Andy worked. And she said somebody had come and needed him to sit and work with them for 2 or 3 hours at a go, and she said, that just doesn't happen. Mr. White will work for about half an hour, and then he has to go feed the chickens. And he'll work for half an hour, and he'll go check on that new baby lamb. Or he'll work for half an hour, and he'll go out and bring in the mail, which was like this. And so I was very glad I had that warning not to expect him to sit with me for hours on end and tell me about the papers I was going to go through. So what we were doing was, we were bringing down box after box of papers from his attic. I would sift through them to make sure that I could identify the author in each case. Sometimes it just had this scribbled signature. Now, I had been through the collection at Cornell enough that I knew the main characters in the New Yorker staff, and they're good friends, they're closest friends. So I could recognize a Thurber signature or a Harold Ross, who was his editor's signature. But if I couldn't, I set those aside, and when I could snag him for a few minutes, I would get him to tell me who that was from. But the most wonderful thing about being in Maine at their home was that he put me in the pickup truck and we went down to the Brooklyn boatyard, which was his son's business. His son was a marine architect.
Brooklyn.
Yes, spelled totally
Yes.
differently from Brooklyn, New York. Yes, and his son Joel had become a marine architect. Well, Mr. White was trundling along in the truck, and he said, "The greatest thing about this little town is that nobody bothers me. I am just not exciting to them. They protect my privacy, but I'm not a celebrity here." He said, "My son is the celebrity. My son is the celebrity because he's on the school board and because he owns the biggest business in town." And it is a very beautiful business and famous business, and now the grandson of Mr. White is running it, and it's famous for Wooden Boat and a magazine and workshops they have there. So anyway, it was really wonderful to get to know him, and he's very shy, very modest about. He just kind of doesn't understand why Walter Cronkite wanted to come interview him on his 80th birthday, and he said, "What's the big deal, you know?" So, and he was very, very generous about who helped him along the way with his writing, even at the age of 70. So at one point, I took all those materials back to Cornell and cataloged them and was working on a bibliography for the E.B. White collection. And at one point he said, "Why do we need that?" And a big part of why we needed it, especially for the White collection, it's not only a huge collection, but in very many cases he wrote with a pseudonym or anonymously altogether. His years of being editor of the Cornell Daily Sun, he must have had 5 or 6 different little pseudonyms, and he'd write a poem over here and an editorial over there and a review of the school play over here. And then the same thing happened in the early days of the New Yorker. Harold Ross wanted it to look like he had dozens of writers clamoring to be in his magazine. So they often wrote with a pseudonym or just without a signature. And for somebody who wanted to really seriously examine Mr. White's work, he needed to know precisely what parts of this editorial were Mr. White's. So that became my job, and it was a sleuthing job in some cases. It involved trying to make sure that what really appeared to the New Yorker matched this manuscript over here, or did this manuscript over here get split in half and sent off to something else, a newspaper or something. And another really good example of why a bibliography is good is that there was a man who was a well-known newspaper man. He wrote for the Christian Science Monitor, Richard Lee Strout, and he submitted a piece to the New Yorker about the Model T, a fond, reminiscent piece about it. And it floated around, and ultimately they decided it wasn't right for the magazine and it was rejected. But Mr. White, Andy, had a Model T and he loved it, and he drove all the way across the country in his Model T. And so it prompted him to write a reminiscent piece about the Model T. And when it was published, it was called Farewell My Lovely in the New Yorker, and Farewell to Model T when it came out in an adorable little book. But he wanted to acknowledge that somebody else had inspired him to write it. So he signed it Lee Strout White. This man was Richard Lee Strout, and he took two of his names and attached them. So he was very careful always to share the credit where credit was due.
One question that comes to mind, Kathy, when you're aware of so much of process and authenticity of what was his, did he write in cursive? Did he type? How did he revise? Did he type and then make revisions on his manuscripts?
He and Katherine both, as New Yorker writers, and I don't know if everyone did this, but I think most people of that generation did. They typed with a carbon copy almost everything they did. And then he did scribble changes but in the margins, but then I think he would pretty promptly retype and perfect that. So in the collection you'd have revisions 1, 2, and 3 possibly before it even went to the New Yorker and might have gotten revised by an editor there. But yeah, no, he was a typist, and in fact there's a picture of him working in the boathouse, and he put the typewriter in the wheelbarrow and went down to the boathouse. He almost never did things handwritten. And when I was working on the bibliography, Mr. White also did me the great favor of if I discovered something and I wasn't absolutely sure, I could write him and say, is this really yours? And is this the thing that showed up in the Saturday Evening Post? And he would often write me back with an anecdote or an explanation or a little side note. And so this was before the days of email. I would promptly write him back by snail mail and say, could I include that paragraph in the bibliography? Bibliography is nothing but a long, boring typed list. We did include illustrations or copies of all the covers, copies of some of the reviews that were wonderful about it. But to have a little paragraph from him explaining how news breaks worked or how different things happened at the New Yorker to make this particular piece come to fruition were just wonderful. Added some real life and interest to the magazine, to the book. And along the line of his editorials, the first time he published a book collection of his editorial pieces, he said he had to thank the, quote, 1,000 mysterious and unremembered sources that all editorial writers rely upon. And I love that because it's true. He had a folder on his desk that he threw things in and other people threw things in, and then there might be something that happened 5 years ago and he pulled that into the editorial. So he was very cautious about giving credit where credit was due. So the other thing is, once you become intimately acquainted with a collection like that, and I was actually the curator of the E.B. White collection, before you leave the job, before you leave town, you have to mount an exhibit of that stuff. And so picture 24 tables, twice as wide as this, or 20, some of them were vertical wall cases. And so I sifted through the collection and found from, his family portrait when he was an infant with his 5 siblings and parents, and his first dog, and his first poem published in the St. Nicholas magazine, and the card he wrote thanking them for publishing it because he was so thrilled to finally be a published writer at the age of 8. And if you came into the library, you would get a brochure that would guide you to all the different parts of the library where all these cases were. In the basement, we had all of the children book illustrations. We had beautiful illustrations from that were Garth Williams originals, and my boss actually, with the help of his children, made a spider web that said "some pig" in it. So the exhibit was really a thrill and fun to do, and a lot of work.
Did he get to see the exhibit?
He did not, but because he was not traveling very much at that point, and there was a big opening, there was a big dinner, and Burton Bernstein, who was the brother of Leonard Bernstein and an author and had written the Thurber biography and stuff, came to be the speaker at that. And so, but I took very careful slides of that exhibit, and I took him the write-ups of each and every single piece there. There's a card beside it saying this is his Presidential Medal of Honor given to him by JFK, except sadly JFK did not get to give it to him, and Senator Muskie bestowed it on him. But all of those things I did take and show him, and he was pretty tickled with it. So it was a wonderful wonderful exhibit. Sadly, that was in 1977, and I was leaving Cornell and moving to Vermont, and as I was leaving, Katherine White died. And
his wife of how many years?
His wife of 48 years at that point. Katherine was the person who hired him originally at the New Yorker, and she hired James Thurber about the same time, and they became office mates and great friends. She was a renowned editor. She helped hire a lot of the early writers for the New Yorker, and she did everything in the early days, and then she became the fiction editor. And she was the person who edited John Updike and Marianne Moore, Thurber, Nabokov, John O'Hara, Ogden Nash, many of our greatest American writers in the 20th century. She was there from 1925 to 1960. And when she left the New Yorker, someone said she was leaving the most powerful job in literature in the United States. She was an editor, but only once a year dabbled in writing. So she wrote an article a year for about gardening. And the very first one was she reviewed seed catalogs as if they were books and talked about the layout and the photography and how well they were written or not written. And and then after that, the New Yorker never let her off the hook. They asked for one a year. And sadly, she wanted to write one last article to pull them all together and did not get to do that. She was always helping Andy with she was really his business manager. You know, there were always new contracts about translations, and there were tons of mail and editing of things. And
do you know my definition of an editor?
What?
I call an editor a person who masters the art of invisible weaving. Because
that's a great one.
You get material, and I think any writer does need an editor, but the person who publishes the article, you never know how much voice that the editor has and all of that. So I think in all the years that she edited, we'll never know how strong her voice was in bringing something that may not have been suitable for publication or needed clarity, because I think the mistake that any of us make in our own writing, what we think is clear in our own head might not be clear to a different audience.
Yes, we always need to have anything important that's written bounced off someone else, because our take on it may not be there in anyone else's at that point. But and she was, someone wrote in one of her obituaries that she got most of America's great fiction writers over their writer's block, their divorces, their alcoholism, their depressions, and she just raised them up. So, and she and Andy had a beautiful, beautiful romance for all those years, and he wanted to pull that book together even though the author was gone. And so I had the wonderful task of working with him to read all of the pieces very carefully to look for anything that was anachronistic or needed explanation. And then also he did not want to publish a book that mentioned a lot of books that were no longer in print. So I did one appendix at the end of all the books that were mentioned and what was out of print and what was not. And then even more important, he didn't want nurserymen and seedsmen mentioned, and then you would go looking for them and they didn't exist anymore. So the other appendix at the back was I had made a master list of all of those that she mentioned that she loved and used, and then I wrote, out of business or changed the name to this or still working or whatever. And that was a real treat. And before doing that with him, I helped him sort and send off all of her manuscript collection. She had been shipping things to Bryn Mawr, her alma mater, for years, but there were some wonderful old letters which I need to share her family tree because they were Sargent, Sergeant, and Shipley, very colonial families.
Yeah, they're from Gloucester, Massachusetts.
She came from,
Yep.
And some were willed to Yale. The Sargent letters were to go to Yale, and the Shepley letters were to go to Bowdoin. And Andy did not want to deal with all that. So I inventoried those, put them in good travel condition. I made a list for the family because I would be kind of sad for them not to know where these things were. And then my husband kindly took Andy fishing for an afternoon while I ransacked all the bookshelves because many of the books in the house were inscribed to her because she had edited them as whole pieces or as parts that were in the New Yorker and then pulled together into a book. And all of that was to get shipped to Bryn Mawr. So that was a wonderful service I rendered to him, which I was so grateful to get to do. He was brokenhearted at losing Katherine and really needed somebody else to do that sort of thing. But it lifted him up a lot to do the book on her gardening pieces, which is called Onward and Upward in the Garden. Her garden pieces in the New Yorker were under the heading Onward and Upward in the Garden. The New Yorker used Onward and Upward for a lot of things. Onward and Upward in the theater, Onward and Upward in politics, but her book is called Onward and Upward in the Garden.
Kathy, for as long as I've known you and knowing that this was an important brush with history for you, a life-changing experience. So as you look back on it now, and being a grandmother, and when it's time for your grandchildren to be reading some of these books, how is your personal experience going to enrich handing over wonderful children's classics like those?
Well, it is a really special treat to have that connection. And I yesterday, going through some of the old letters I had written Mr. White, that I had to stop typing a letter to him to go and talk to a class of third graders who had come to see the exhibit. And I said, who said kids don't read anymore? I said, they have memorized your 3 books. When they saw Laura Ingalls Wilder, they knew exactly who she was, and they've read all of her books. And I am very blessed already with 3 little grandsons who love books, love to read. And it is just, and they're not reading them on a tablet, they are reading books, and I love that. And it'll be a real treat for me to sit down with them when they're older and tell them about Mr. White and tell them, he resisted for many years letting anybody make a film out of Charlotte's Web. He thought a book should be a book, and he wanted people to enjoy it for that. And it worried him that, he did finally break down and let somebody make a film of it. But his experiences were priceless, and mine with him were priceless.
Kathy, thank you so much for being our guest today. And I think anyone who thinks that making a bibliography is something that is cut and dry, you've proven that it is just a wonderful, immersive experience.
Yeah.
So thank you.
It was great. Thank you.